the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations are dominated by neoliberal thought, we will prove to you why policies tailored under a neoliberal agenda do not fit the economic and social structures within the BRICS countries. We will prove to you why the solutions that could be potentially tailored by the BRICS countries, for the BRICS countries, will be better for themselves politically and ideologically on the long term. And finally, we will prove to you that even if we cannot 100% guarantee that those policies will provide better off economic solutions, it is better in terms of accountability and responsibility of politicians that will not be able now to wash their hands off away with the big bad IMF and World Bank organization, right? So first things first. Pretty simple in terms of what we have in mind when we talk about it. We basically think that the BRICS countries are going to be able to establish institutions themselves that are going to provide money loans, that are going to settle disputes, that are going to regulate trade agreements, that are going to control basically investments that they make in developing countries or in their own countries, right? So we think that's established. Now, why do we believe that there is enough evidence to think that these institutions that have immense power, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, are actually dominated by one particular political ideology? We think that it has been pretty obvious since the Washington Consensus, since the rise of Hayek, since basically Keynes failed after the Second World War, that neoliberal thought has dominated these kind of policies and practices. Neoliberal thought is present in the Chicago School of Economics, which basically regulates a lot of the monopolies and how they're handling in the economy, how they act in the economy. Neoliberal thought is present in the Fed, in the US, is present in Harvard, where all these kind of people are educated, where further future policymakers are educated, right? So we believe that they have a huge imprint on how the policies are tailored further on in these institutions. We think that actors that hold neoliberal thoughts are present in meetings such as the G7, the G20, that they have an impact on decisions. We think that by the policies that the IMF has implemented, for example, in Eastern Europe during the times of transition, it is pretty obvious that they're stuck on austerity and they're not really open in considering other options. We have seen that those kind of policies have not necessarily been very successful, right? Now,
clarification.
Yeah?
What exactly is the alternative economic ideology they're going to be proposing?
We believe that the alternative economic ideology is basically one of investments rather than austerity. With providing further investment, that you invest in the economy, you create a cycle of multiplication. So basically, if I need to build a building, I'm going to need resources to build this building, which means that I'm going to buy some resources, which means that I'm generating more capital by the fact that I'm making an investment. We believe that potentially this is a solution which is better for those countries. But further on, we don't necessarily think that we need to tailor political policy, economic policies in this debate, right? Now, second point, why don't neoliberal solutions actually work within the, why don't neoliberal solutions work for these kind of countries? One, we think that they don't work for ideological reasons. The people and the politicians are ideologically alienated from the message that this policy sends, right? Austerity is a policy that doesn't promote solidarity. Austerity is a policy that doesn't promote social cohesion. Austerity is a policy of individualism. We believe that in countries that are built on strong social bonds, those policies do not seem meaningful or reasonable. We don't think that people can internalize those policies and strongly relate to them, right? But secondly, we don't think that they also don't fit to the economy. They don't fit to the economy, which is basically, which is still developing, right? There is not enough capital in this economy, so stopping the flow of capital in the economy is not going to solve. In developing countries, such as the BRICS countries, we actually need an inflow of capital rather than a shortage of capital. So we don't think that these policies work. But further on, we think that there is a perverse incentive on the side of these institutions to not necessarily focus on the interest of the BRIC countries. Why is that? Because obviously, countries such as the US that dominate the decision-making process in those institutions have an intrinsic interest of what kind of trade agreements are made within the Latin American countries, we need NAFTA, etc., etc. We think that there is a conflicted interest in this decision-making process, which is harming the decision-making process and is not bringing about the best results for those kind of countries, right? And we think that we should be focusing on the impact on the population of these countries and how they are going to be affected by this decision and what is best for them, right? Why do we think that this is actually going to bring about problem solvency? Well, first of all, we think that one obvious result of this is going to be a limitations on free trade. And we think that this is actually good for those countries because they're not going to be priced out from the international trade market. We think that they are going to have an ability to create a competition on their own level, right? They will be able to create competencies on their own level. In the status quo, if I'm a developing country, I don't possess the skills, resources, and efficiency to actually provide goods or services that are competitive on the international trade market, right? We believe that this is stagnation. economy of these countries. And if they have the ability to regulate their own trade agreements, to regulate their own markets, etc., it will be much better off for them because they will have the opportunity to compete on equal grounds. Basically, it would be like an ESO category in debate, right?
Question?
We think that's good. Go ahead.
The problem with allowing developing countries to put up tariff barriers and defend themselves from free trade is developed countries then retaliate. So crucially, they can compete on a more equal playing field, but they can no longer sell goods to the US or to Europe.
In the status quo, they don't sell that many goods to the US and Europe, and we think that if we actually take out the Western goods from the BRICS market, they will be able to infiltrate it with BRICS goods. We don't think that this is necessarily a problem, right? So we think that, they will be better able to tailor solutions for themselves because they have the intrinsic interest to do that, they have the incentives to do that. But finally, what we are also telling you is that, right, economic policies come and go, they fail, we cannot 100% guarantee what is the right solution. But even if we don't think that investments are better than austerity, we think that having the ability to hold these decisions within the BRICS countries where they have the biggest impact is crucial in this debate, because only then will the citizens be able to hold politicians accountable for the decisions that are being made. No longer will Argentina be able to say, oh well, it was the IMF policies that they proposed that are basically messing up our country at the moment, right? We think that it would be much better if it is the local politicians tailoring the local policies, so then they would have to think twice about the long-term decisions that they're making. This is incredibly important because policies that reflect austerity measures, long-term investments, these kind of regulations have a huge long-term impact on the economy on generations to come. If a politician doesn't have the incentive to think twice because they know that they can wash their hands easily with the IMF, they're less likely to make a more informed decision. They're less likely to make a more cautious decision about this, right? So at the end of the day, we believe that the current solutions provided by these institutions do not work because they are dominated by neoliberal thought. We believe that those countries have the incentive, capability, and resources to actually do that for themselves, and it will be better on the long term for the accountability of politicians we beg to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech and call upon the leader of the opposition to open the case for opposition side.
Notice the motion doesn't suggest that we're trying to solve the mid-90s Asian debt crisis, right? Notice the motion is asking us to deal with the economic model as it exists today. So maybe 15 or 20 years ago, the changes to the IMF and the World Bank might have been plausible. But notice they've made significant and serious changes to their governing practices since the problems of the mid-90s, right? Specifically, the East Asian debt crisis was often the reason why these governance models changed. They've much more balanced their boards in terms of representation from BRIC countries and from other countries that are affected by their policies, right? Notice how the IMF has criticized the ECB for austerity in Europe, right? Saying that you should be spending more money in Greece rather than less. How the World Bank has led a global movement for greater NGO involvement in international aid, as opposed to government involvement, which has been much more beneficial for developing countries in terms of how their development aid has been operated. Look at the comparative, right? We prefer BRIC countries to seek involvement and mediation through the IMF, through the World Bank, through the World Trade Organization. We would notice that she says she prefers an economic model that advocates investment, right? We think that's status quo in the IMF and the World Bank, and something we'd like to see continue. So I'm going to say these institutions will be worse, no thank you, than the status quo. Why I think the consequences of competition between a BRIC model, sort of IMF or World Bank or WTO, would be very harmful, and why we don't want to see a new Cold War or a new trade Cold War between the West and the BRICS, right? And why they won't work and why they won't do things. So notice that opening fails to demonstrate that there's a greater amount of accountability in this new model. She says that the IMF or the World Bank might make decisions that are bad for developing countries, but gives no reasons as to why the BRICS would make decisions that are better for developing countries. So why will these institutions be much worse than the status quo? Well, we think, first of all, many of them are interested in naked foreign policy interests, right? We think, first of all, China will dominate in many instances these organizations, right? We think it's going to take on, it would take on something similar to a U.S. role in things like the IMF and the World Bank. But look at what China's been doing in terms of economic development in the rest of the world. It's been buying up agricultural land in Africa, specifically targeting areas that has the kinds of materials it needs, but ignoring areas that doesn't, right? So countries benefit only determined on whether China has any interest in that country, right? We think that is not the kind of naked foreign policy interest we think benefits developing countries or benefits BRIC countries. But also look at the kinds of corruption that we think would result from a BRIC model, IMF or World Bank. So first of all, we think the vast majority of these countries have weak institutions, weak democratic institutions to hold corruption to account, and high levels of corruption. We're talking about places like Russia, where corruption is state-instituted. We're talking about places like China, where corruption is covered up in order to protect economic growth, right? So we think that the IMF and the World Bank currently have to deal with huge sums of money. And if they're proposing anything that can offer the developing world any kinds of benefits, they must be dealing with reasonably large sums of money that pass through the hands of institutions that do not have the capability to prevent corruption at a very high level. What does that do? So funds become more and more and more misappropriated. This leads to hospitals and schools not being built, promises broken. What does that do? It makes people less trustworthy of their government, makes them feel that the institutions in their country don't work for them or can't work for them. The rest of the world can't work for them. It breaks down democratic trust or your ability to have some kinds of democratic government, or even in countries that aren't democracy, for you to be able to participate in whatever levels of government are available to you. It weakens governance and breaks down democratic norms. But look at the strong authoritarian tendencies in a lot of BRIC countries, right? So we're talking about places like Russia and China, which are authoritarian, but also places like India, which have weaker democratic institutions and have larger voting blocks that they're able to leverage in order to make safer seats, right? That's kind of like the intimidation we see in Indian politics, right? So we think first of all, the IMF and the World Bank currently use their loans as leverage to bring kinds of benefits, right? They say increase democratic norms, or they demand certain leverage for those loans. But we think that these countries will make much harsher leverage, will demand much harsher responsibilities for these loans. Why? So first of all, they're not democracies, right? We think many of them are. We think they're less concerned with electoral interests, right? We also think they're much used to faster change or being able to ignore the kinds of electoral interests on the ground, right? Even places like India are much more willing to ignore sort of low-level electoral interests, right? Things like build stadiums where people's houses used to be and not pay anybody back, right? So I think that means that demand much faster change, but much harsher change. What does that result in? It results in biting cuts to countries, reduced social welfare, the kinds of subsidies that mean people can buy electricity in the Dominican Republic gone, right? People go hungry, people go cold, people are unable to study for school without lights, right? That's the kinds of things that result from economic mismanagement on their side. We think also this institution would have less scrutiny. It hasn't stayed standing. It hasn't built up the kinds of criticism or scrutiny that the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO have in the West. Well, why? First of all, the West is part of these institutions. They're much more ready to criticize them in case they aren't benefiting them or aren't benefiting the world. But also we think we have the years and years of scrutiny that build up. Go ahead, be quick.
Why is it fear that the US has the exorbitant privilege of engaging in maturity transformation, whereby it lends out its money at an interest rate 1.5% higher than the rates it borrows at?
Okay, so first of all, because you can come up with a fact you had in your book, right, doesn't mean that it's going to change the way that the BRICS can demonstrate that money. It doesn't change the accountability. Doesn't change the accountability factors that I've just been talking about, right? Like if you have less accountability for these countries, they demand greater leverage, and they hurt these countries more, right? We failed to demonstrate greater accountability on this side, and we don't think you will. Why is the competition in foreign policy particularly important? So right now, under the status quo, the IMF and the World Bank are sort of moving towards a more benign, kind of independent kind of government. But know what happens here, right? So one, we have two competitive institutions, right? They're trying to do the same things, and the countries in them want to demonstrate that they can do it the best. So first of all, we think this is used as a foreign policy tool. Like economic development or promises of development have been used as foreign policy tools in the past. But notice this will be used to determine loyalty or as a sign of defection among countries. The the same kind of way that Russia's been using allegiance to the EU to determine loyalty in Eastern Europe, right? So we think that when you when a country doesn't agree to take part in this, but like Russia or China thinks they're in their sphere of influence, we think that leads to retaliation, but also forces to choose, right? You can't flip back and forth or make a bidding war because the kinds of structural investment in here last 20, 25 years, right? So that you keep in order to get that money, you need to commit to it for the long term. But under the status quo inside the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO, all countries have a strong stake in making sure these institutions are pulling in the same direction, right? But now they're pulling in opposite directions, right? If you're trying to stop a currency crisis, some people are trying to keep the currency value high in order to keep citizens' incomes high, but some people are forcing it down to make exports cheaper. You flood money into solving the same problem, pulling against each other in different directions, right? We think that has very serious harms in terms of economic mismanagement around the globe. So, oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their final speech and call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for government side.
Neoliberalism is a political ideology of market fundamentalism that was developed in the West to serve the interests of the West. We're very happy to stand on side opening government for the end of this neoliberal world order. But notice that we're not replacing this world order, right? We're not tearing down the IMF. Instead, what we're doing is we're building additional institutions. What we think is going to result because of this on our side of the house is more competition between these institutions, a plurality of ideas, and basically we'll be able to cater different ideas to different countries and different policies that might be beneficial to them. What I'm going to develop in my speech is specifically how this comparative and this competition between these institutions is specifically going to be important for the most important actor in this debate, which is the BRICS countries and other developing countries which have been stagnating at the expense of the West. We believe that that's incredibly important. Before that, a few points of engagement with the previous speaker. So she tells us that the IMF is going through some changes. We think that this is completely false, right? Maybe that's some sort of rhetoric, but if you look at the recent crisis, what's been happening in Europe, what they did in Greece, in Romania, and Hungary, and all of these countries, it's been the same old stuff. It's been austerity. If you want a loan, you have to pay the price. No, thank you. Salaries in Romania cut by 25% in the public sector. Greece wreaking havoc in the streets. We believe that this is the status quo. No, thank you. Second of all, they tell us that there's investment in the status quo, right? Obviously, this is not comparative. Of course, these institutions provide investment, but they provide it for a specific price. You can only get the investment if you do the austerity. Why is this? Two reasons. Number one, because it's risky for them to make these investments. Therefore, they want these countries to be able to pay back at some point. Second of all, these institutions are simply filled with ideologues. These people simply believe in market fundamentalism. We think that this is likely to change because of the reasons that Christina gave you. Because you'll have different institutions, different people staffing, the Chinese IMF and so on and so forth. Second of all, we tell you that China has less of an interest and is less stringent on getting this money back. If you notice how they invest in Africa right now, they invest all over the place because they know they're developing, they know they have to gain the interest of these countries. They know that they don't even care if the money goes back. They're less likely to push for austerity. We believe that's good. No, thank you. Third point is that they tell us that these institutions are corrupt. Notice how this is incredibly non-comparative, right? Like, these institutions are corrupt in the status quo. These countries are corrupt in the status quo. No, thank you. If the incentives exist for corruption is going to happen. That's fine. But notice how this point is actually irrelevant because what we give you on our side of the house is simply more funds, right? If you have the IMF and the BRICS IMF altogether, you have two funds from which you can take money. So at the point of which you can waste, no thank you, 50% of your fund, if we tell you that you have two funds, we think that you get more schools on the comparative. We believe we win on that. Fourth point of rebuttal, they simply tell us that these institutions are likely to push for fast change and economic mismanagement. We don't get any analysis on this. We tell you that on the comparative, even if they give us some analysis in the second speaker, we don't see why the incentives would be different, right? Like, we're sure that the BRICS countries have a lot of experts that can manage these things well. We think that actually on the comparative, the BRICS have a unique experience of development. Notice how China didn't develop in the same way as the US, neither does Brazil. They develop through a lot of savings and investments, right? They save a lot, they don't give high salaries, they tax a lot, they invest and they build their economy. Notice how this is likely to be a model that is going to be beneficial for a lot of countries. So on the comparative, you have more ideas and more chances for different countries to develop. We believe that that's very important. Lastly, they tell us something that there's going to be a trade war. We don't see why that's necessarily bad, right? Like more competition in trade rules and this kind of stuff means that countries will have more options. We think that that's good. So going into my substantive, first of all, why do we think that comparatively, simply the countries that will choose these institutions will be better off? A couple of things. Austerity. We tell you that austerity means, number one, less social protection. We think that this is very bad for workers investing in their skills, which is bad for long-term economic development. Second of all, we tell that this leads to deflation because you cut salaries, you cut like across the board, which means that people have less money to invest in the economy. That's very bad specifically for developing countries, which rely on this kind of investment to develop themselves. Lastly, we tell you that you simply have less demand. We think that's incredibly bad. Second mechanism that we give you here is free trade, right? Notice how most countries nowadays, if they want to access global markets, they have to accept stringent rules of free trade imposed by the WTO. We tell you that that's incredibly bad for countries like Africa or even countries like Brazil. We tell you that on the comparative, this gives them a separate mechanism to make different trade deals, right? You don't have to go to the WTO, you can go to the WTO of the BRICS, which means that you can make separate agreements with China, with India, with Brazil, or with other developing countries. No, thank you. This means that African countries are more likely to develop because they can export their products to markets in which they're competitive. Nigeria can then export to the Ivory Coast, whereas they couldn't do this in the status quo because they would have to abide by the rules of the WTO. Notice how, again, no, thank you, on the comparative, their point on trade war simply falls here because we tell you that, fine, you have competing arrangements. It means that then the US, if they want to convince Cameroon or other countries to join the WTO or to abide by those rules, it means that the WTO is going to have, on the comparative, more incentives to cater to these countries because they want these countries to be part of the WTO because that's where the US sort of has more influence. So we feel that that's fundamentally good. No, thank you. Now, second point of substantive, why comparatively having more institutions is better, right? Simply we give you as a very simple benefit, you have more funds, right? You simply have more funds that you can choose from as a developing country. But second of all, we tell you that this can cater to different kind of countries, right? So if you're a country that is ideologically neoliberal, you can go to the IMF, you can get those funds, and you can implement austerity in your home country, like if that works. But we tell you that more importantly, most countries don't believe in austerity. Look at Latin America, that has a very strong socialist tradition, that they don't believe in this stuff, which means that they're not likely to access funds from the IMF, precisely because they don't believe in neoliberal institutions. Notice that on the comparative now they have a way to access a lot of these important funds to develop their economies in the way that they see fit. Go.
Okay, so you say Latin America has a specific socialist institution and doesn't want to implement austerity. How high exactly is inflation in Venezuela at the moment because they refuse to implement?
Okay, sorry, like Venezuela is simply like a really weird case and we don't think it's necessarily part of this debate. Most other countries in Latin America and the world are doing fine. Venezuela is not likely to cooperate with the IMF anyway. Maybe they would actually cooperate on the comparative with our institutions and maybe sort of even give some, provide some basic services to the population. Last benefit we give you on the comparative there is that we tell you that you're more likely to have a reform of international institutions on our side of the house. So even with the IMF and the WTO, you're more likely to have them reformed on our side of the house because now they have some competition of ideas and of interest. They're going to have to cater to a lot of these countries, which means that even in Europe, the IMF, where it has to make deals with the ECB and so on, is likely to be less stringent and be more reformed. Lastly, as a benefit, we give you that you're going to keep politicians more accountable. Why does this happen? It happens because in the status quo, a lot of neoliberal politicians in developing countries use the excuse of the WTO and the IMF. Not just developing countries, actually, like Romania as well, where politicians were like, our hands are tied, there's nothing we can do, we're going to cut all of these salaries, we're going to cut all of these benefits. Notice that because of this, these politicians can't be held accountable, which means that democracy hurts a lot in these countries. Notice how in the comparative, because on our side of the house there's so much choice to work with different institutions, politicians are no longer able to use this argument, which means that they're going to be held accountable to the choice they make between the IMF and the BRIC IMF. So, ladies and gentlemen, because of that, we're very happy to have the neoliberal world order. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for that speech. You called upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for opposition bench.
administration of the IMF and of the World Bank is just a decade or 2 decades out of date. Recognise that the IMF has made a number of fundamental reforms in terms of not being so fixated on austerity. This was precisely because they saw the devastating effects and their chronic mismanagement of debt crises both in Latin America in the 80s and in East Asia in the 1990s. A number of the criticisms of neoliberalism that Prof made have some truth in them. The IMF has by and large recognised these. Recognised additionally, the global financial crisis in 2008 has killed the ideology of neoliberalism. It is effectively shown, it is like in terms of economic academia, it's effectively shown that laissez-faire, that excessive austerity harms economies and it ultimately isn't a benefit. Recognise that the BRIC involvement in the IMF is something that has been crucial towards moderating the IMF's opinion on this. Because recognise, the amount of votes you get in the IMF or in the World Bank is based upon how much money you put into the basket. So how much currency you're putting into the IMF's currency basket or how much development funding you're putting into the World Bank. Crucially, as the BRIC economies grow, they're putting more and more funding into this, so they're gaining more and more votes. So increasingly going forward, this calculation is becoming even more true. I'm going to deal with a couple of miscellaneous points of rebuttal. I'm going to tackle their contention about neoliberalism. Then I'm essentially just going to rebuild and extend off ethics material as to why we essentially think creating global competition this is likely to be harmful. First of all, on the contention that BRIC needs are ignored by these institutions. Recognise the BRICs aren't the main beneficiaries of these institutions because they're by and large too developed. The countries which get sort of World Bank development funding are the genuine third world, and the countries who are much less developed. But recognise it's sort of a zero-sum game then for the BRICs, because they're the ones putting all the money into this new World Bank and new IMF. They're just taking money out of it. It's zero-sum for them. They're not gaining any more money, right? Secondly, on the point of accountability, this is wholly irrelevant, because recognise, if it is true that politicians are able under the status quo to say, my hands are tied by the IMF, they can still say on their side of the house, my hands are tied by this new BRIC IMF and BRIC World Bank. Lastly, on the contention that there are just more funds for developing countries. Recognise this isn't true, because the BRICs are pooling their money out of the IMF and out of the World Bank to set up this new organisation. So we think it's the same amount of money is available to developing countries on either side of the house. On either side of the house, or insofar as countries could put more money in, that's something they could do equally on both sides of the house. Like we'd obviously be fine with the BRICs putting more money into the current IMF. In response to the closing government POI, as to that it's unfair that the US gains a number of advantages from the dollar being the world reserve currency. First of all, I don't particularly care about fairness, right? I think if it's economically beneficial for the world at large, I think that's good. Secondly, I don't see how it's significantly more fair that you now just have the dollar as a reserve currency, but also the yuan. Like, I don't like. It's still probably unfair for the other 208 countries whose currencies aren't reserve countries. Lastly, recognise the world gains substantive benefits from the dollar being a reserve currency. The reason the dollar is quite a good reserve currency is because its value has been very stable for a long time, because the US is still the largest economy in the world and is going to be so for several decades. And recognise there's already significant Chinese checks to prevent the US from abusing this power. Notice that China holds the vast majority of American government and American sovereign debt. So China already has extensive economic leverage that has prevented the US from abusing this. On the main contention from opening up that neoliberalism is always bad, I've pointed out I think the neoliberalism characterization is misled, but recognise the comparative that they propose. They essentially propose countries should be able to pick and choose. They don't have to follow any of the neoliberalism or the checks the IMF put on them. But recognise these checks are often beneficial for countries. So for countries. So first of all, on the fact that on the contention that people just don't accept neoliberalism or austerity, I think people tend to accept whatever works, right? People accept whatever puts food on the table and keeps them in jobs. So I think this is just a clash about efficacy. Secondly, the idea that these countries don't have enough capital. Recognise that's a problem that's aggravated when they're seen to be fiscally irresponsible and spending excessively. Precisely because in order for them to get more capital, it needs to come from the West. It needs to come from investors and banks there who provide foreign direct investment, which they're not going to do if they're terrified that the value of their investment is going to be eroded away by inflation. On the contention that deflation is excessively bad for developing countries, I point out deflation is very uncommon in developing countries, precisely because deflation tends to be a problem that affects stagnant developed economies when they're not growing faster. By far the opposite problem is inflation. If you have the case that countries are spending excessively, I recognise local governments often have a strong incentive to do this. They want to essentially buy votes with higher public spending. They will often borrow excessively. If there are no external checks imposed on these by international organisations, particularly if they're bidding against each other to lower the value of the external checks, there's no reason politicians can stop printing money and borrowing excessively. Recognise that when countries are printing more and more money and borrowing more and more, the value of their currency gets completely eroded. So you get hyperinflation over the long run, meaning they can't export or import goods into the people. will suffer. The example of this would be Zimbabwe, who essentially didn't obey IMF checks, and the country's economy completely collapsed as a result. On the contention that free trade is bad, I think this is ludicrous. Recognise the vast explosion in economic development that countries have seen over the past decade. Global poverty is collapsing at an excessively fast rate, precisely because of the benefits of free trade. All of these are worsened if they want to return to an era of protectionism and bring back tariff wars. Tom.
China managed to ensure credibility for the AIIB by inviting in countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, Hong Kong, and Japan. What do you think this sounds like an unchecked balance on Chinese power that's simply going to lend out irresponsibly and never impose any checks?
No, I don't think we ever really made that contention. There'll be some checks, but China will still be able to use this as a leverage for power, which is that economic power can translate to political power when you're providing these loans. Sure, there's some checks, and I still think we're winning the comparative on that. So specifically, as to why creating two external organisations are likely to be colossally bad. First of all, this cripples your ability to respond to global financial problems and global economic instability. Under the status quo, all of the world's economic interests are essentially aligned because we're all contributing to the same economic system, to the same system of currency stability. So all countries have an incentive to ensure that, to essentially ensure that other countries aren't economically collapsing. On their side of the house, they create a perverse incentive at the point at which each bloc now has an incentive to see the other one fail, because they want to prove to countries that their own bloc is more successful. This cripples your ability to cooperate. Secondly, this essentially makes free trade impossible, because recognise it's not true that the countries could just pick and choose and trade with members of both blocs, because if you're imposing different rules for free trade in the two different blocs, these will be mutually exclusive. If the Chinese bloc says that you're able to put on tariff barriers and protectionism, this necessarily excludes you from the World Bank, and the status quo bloc. Recognise this makes it far harder for developing countries to develop at the point at which they can no longer export the goods they have comparative advantages in, because there's crippling tariffs being put on them by the West. Developing countries are not likely to be the winners of a trade war against the West developed countries because they're vastly greater economic power. Lastly is the point that the two different policies will then be pushing against each other. So there are two legitimate responses to an economic crisis. One is you might want to increase spending in the country to try and sort of boost your output and retain incomes. The second is you might want to implement austerity to try and attract more foreign direct investment. If you have two different systems pushing against each other, you're not achieving either result, but you're just wasting money pouring it into it while the crisis is prolonged. It is better to essentially pick either one rather than two pushing against each other. I genuinely think this would be one of the worst economic developments since the Great Depression. Oppose.
That's very nice speaking that word speech and call upon a member of government to continue the case for government bench.
This debate is about comparative advantage, it's about capital markets, and it's about monetary policy. Let's play ball. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why the status quo entrenches unfair advantages that the US has within the global financial system, why that's terrible. Secondly, why we increase competition on our side of the house. One point about standing rebuttal to opening up, first of all. On the contention that all of these institutions will be literally the most corrupt things ever. That analysis, basically all of it, might be true if China was the one setting up these institutions. Note that is never what we proposed. We proposed several countries contributing to these, namely all of the BRICS. We find it wholly implausible that Brazil would have specific financial interest in advancing the neo-colonialist agenda of China in South Africa. And crucially, all of these countries which are now buying into new institutions don't want to be permanently locked out of them in the way they have been locked out of the IMF and the World Bank. So they're likely to demand bigger voting rights. They're likely to do things like contribute more money so that essentially they can buy interest and prevent it being dominated by a single country like China. We think we will get much less corruption because this will be a genuinely pluralist institution, perhaps for the first time ever. Let's move on to substantive, the rest of the rebuttal will be integrated. So, status quo entrenches unfair advantages that the US has, because the status quo of international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, lending to many countries across the world, but doing so, crucially, in dollars, and dollars primarily. Why is that so important in this debate? And why exactly does it happen, first of all? The US is the prime contributor of funds to these institutions, and it contributes primarily in dollars. Crucially, it also attempts to shut out the contributions of other countries, because if it loses its status as the prime contributor of money, then it loses most of its voting rights and it loses the ability to control these institutions in the first place. So the way in which they weight contributions actually disproportionately favours the dollar and means that China can contribute less. So what exactly does that mean in practice? It means that central banks across the world, governments in BRICS, governments in sub-Saharan Africa, are all taking out loans perpetually in dollars from international institutions. They have to pay their debts in dollars. They have to pay interest on their debts in dollars. All their bond markets are determined in dollars. So every country in the world which borrows from the IMF and the World Bank, which for the record is everyone, it's developing countries, the UK did it in the 1970s, all of the southern EU have been doing it for the last 5 years. All of these countries have artificially high demand for dollars. Everyone needs to buy as many US assets as possible because they're denominated in dollars. There are several catastrophic harms to this privilege that the US has. Firstly, it means that US banks, stocks, bonds, assets are in huge demand, which basically means the US can borrow money on the world market incredibly cheaply because everyone wants dollars and everyone wants to buy US assets. What that means is that the US is permanently entrenched as the financial capital of the world to the extent that it actively crowds out other developing and nascent banking sectors. Basically because there's no hope that China can compete with the capital market that has such an entrenched unfair advantage as the US one, even though China could probably set up a flourishing financial sector if it wanted, given it's the second largest economy in the world. Why do we care so much about these sorts of financial institutions? Because imagine what would happen if Shanghai, if Rio, if Beijing, if Delhi could become New York and London, if they could draw on the capital markets of the whole world and pump that money into their own economies. We suggest that would probably be the biggest financial boom in all of history, considering what happened with only a small investment boom in China in the 1990s, which turned China into the second largest economy in the world. Literally half of the world's population could be exponentially benefited from the kind of growth that could see. But the second reason why we think entrenching dollar hegemony is so bad, because if everyone borrows and demands dollars, that means they're inherently reliant on the institution of the Federal Reserve, essentially, and of the institutions of the United States specifically. Because if they're all reliant so heavily on dollars, that means they're reliant on US monetary policy, which determines the value of the dollar. So if the Federal Reserve decides that there's a housing bubble looming in Detroit, or that they want to boost employment figures in the run-up to a general election, that can literally screw the whole world, because it means that suddenly the dollar's value is fluctuating, and suddenly people can no longer repay their debts. No thanks. Let's move on to my second point of extension then, about competitions for loans. What we think happens now is that now people can borrow in multiple currencies. Because as I mentioned in my point of rebuttal, all these BRIC countries have incentives to contribute as much as possible to the new institutions in order to entrench their own voting rights, which basically means these new institutions lend out in a vast plurality of countries. That means that countries wanting to borrow money can borrow in currencies which more closely track the value of their own currency. Which basically means they can pick the one which is least likely to fluctuate in the long term, they can pick the most stable in the long term, and they can also pick the cheapest. So many will borrow in the renminbi, many will borrow in rupees, etc. That ultimately means that more loans are given on more beneficial terms, which means basically that developing countries can borrow more and in a more sustainable way. Secondly, we tell you that the terms of the loans are likely to be more beneficial, because the IMF and the World Bank have imposed vicious terms in the past, not only in the ways opening government described, but also the fact that they forced off fire sales of state assets and privatised too quickly, essentially entrenched oligarchic elites within all of these countries, which kills the possibility of democracy in them for the rest of time. We think you'll get better deals on our side of the house, because there's competition between the same institutions. They have a response to this, which is like, you can't be part of several institutions at once. The United Kingdom, until very recently, was part of the European Union, the European Central Bank, the WTO, and the Asian Investment Bank.
Yes.
You can empirically be part of multiple institutions at once. But secondly, you can borrow from say, the AIB, pay off your debt to the IMF, and then join the AIB instead. So you can get a loan from one, which enables you to transfer between the two. I'll take Rory.
So the Brazilian, Russian, and South African economies are tanking, and India is the biggest beneficiary from World Bank money. So China are going to be leading these banks, and the yuan is just going to replace the dollar and have all the harms.
We dispute the premise that they're tanking under the status quo. Maybe there's short-term economic growth, but maybe there's short-term economic downturn, but ultimately they're some of the most prosperous economies in the world. This is probably just a fluke based on commodity booms. We don't care about that fact. So let's talk briefly then about monetary policy. We think that monetary policy across the world becomes hugely more accountable as a result of this policy. Because at the moment, China is able to manipulate its currency in subtle ways to ensure that it has unfair competitive advantages over the rest of the world, which screws economies across the world and also is bad for China because it does things like reduce employment and reduce capital spending. Why exactly does this get so much better? We stop China manipulating its currency on our side of the house, because now every time China attempts to manipulate its currency or artificially tweak the rates, then Brazil, Russia, and India are all directly affected by that. Because essentially they're all part of the same, because they're part of the same institution, and because basically a changes or sudden change in the value of the yuan or the renminbi will affect them as well. So they can exert pressure on China and do things like retaliate through the same institutions to stop China affecting its monetary policy in this way. We hugely empower the forces of international accountability on our side of the house. Ultimately, we don't want it to be the case that for the rest of time, financial decisions about the fate of humanity are taken in New York and Washington DC. It's on that basis alone, and also because of T. Simpson's POI, which none of us understood, but I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank you very much for that speech and call upon a member of opposition to the case for chair.
So the great thing about being born after 1991 is that as these economic institutions have proliferated, standards of living across the world has increased, and with it, the world has generally seen a trend towards democratization and an increase in the quality of life. In extension, while opening opposition talk about rivalry in foreign policy, they talk about things like general development, we're going to talk about why the types of policies advocated for by the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO are likely to, in the long term, lead to greater democratization and increase in standard of living in the developing world, which we believe is the most important actor in this debate because it's the actor that is most reliant on these institutions and most affected by these institutions, and likely to be by far the most affected in real terms in their daily lives by this change. Before that, a couple of responses to the closing government extension. Listen, okay, so they dispute the premise. Unfortunately, the premise is true and they gave us no reason not to believe it's true. Brazil is now in the biggest recession since it abolished slavery in 1861, right? At the same time, like Russia is experiencing intense sanctions, they've recently had to increase massively the tax they place on their oil sales, which means that the revenues for oil companies reach such levels they probably won't be able to reinvest in finding new oil reserves. So even if they come back with buffet of oil, they won't have the money to find the oil in future. We think that is a massive long-term harm. So in the short term, we do think that really this will just be China, and comparatively, it is likely that there will be a hegemony of the renminbi on their side of the house, right? But even in the long term, we think that China's economy is probably unstable, no thank you, but it's the one that will dominate in the short term when they set this up. Secondly, on fairness. Firstly, note that we never actually get a reason why we should prioritize fairness in and of itself. Like opening opposition say, we don't care, right? Like as long as people economically benefit, we think that's the metric. But moreover, like in terms of having dollars, yeah, that makes things unfair. We think that having dollars makes trade easier, right? You can actually just like, trade and have like a common exchange price. You don't have to go through all these other things. We think that that's a good thing to have a relatively well understood international currency so that trade transactions can be done more smoothly, more quickly, reducing transaction costs. Okay, but even if you do care about that extension, it is comparatively better that the hegemony would be of a democratic state like the United States promoting that sort of thing, and that's why an extension beats their stuff, than the hegemony of a state that doesn't have an interest in that, or like property owning or anything like that, like China. Next thing, just some responses to opening government's case. Firstly, just to weigh in on the clash about accountability. Right, so like, when they talk about the idea of accountability, what they're really saying is that leaders are going to have to take accountability for their own actions. The problem with this is that it's non-comparative because they equally wash their hands from the bricks. But moreover, in times of crisis, right, they actually don't genuinely have many choices. They have to like choose like the least bad option. So like, often they don't actually have more than one choice. So that means that the accountability is basically a wash on either side of the house. In terms of free trade and why their alternative is good, like the whole point of why free trade is good and the WTO works is because you multilateralize your trade policy, so you have access to this huge market on that basis. We think that's why. The last thing on this is like when they talk about the culture of Latin America and say it's not Venezuela. I mean, it's probably exactly what the DPM was thinking when he said that point. Okay, firstly, extension. I'll take more information if you back up.
Yeah, so your basic extension is that China is going to dominate us. We give you a lot of analysis to why you would raise competition between these kinds of institutions and why China itself would not be able to dominate, at the point at which both China and the US have interest in the developing world. They're going to have to compete and lower the
Okay, right. What you gave was analysis as to why there'd be competition between the BRICS institutions and the Western institutions. Our contention is that maybe that is the case. To the extent that it's the case, it's a bad thing because you can't multilateralize your trade policy in that way. But moreover, our contention is that China will dominate those BRICS institutions, so those harms accrue on your side of the house, just in two sort of separate economic worlds, like the pre-1991 world, which I never lived through and never want to live through. Okay, so extension on the types of policies we're talking about. We think so neoliberalism has been incredibly poorly defined. I'm not sure if it exists or not anymore. I think opening opposition say it's been destroyed. I think that's basically a fair claim, right? That the neoliberal ideology of aggressive austerity has been abandoned. No, thank you. But in terms of what we think the types of policies that are now advocated by the IMF. Last thing about India. Yeah, India also is entirely reliant on the World Bank. They have a special deal with the IDRC in terms of long-term development. That means that opting out of this is going to be significantly deleterious to their own economic development. So that's just a point on their address. So what are we talking about when by aggressively capitalist policies that promote? We're talking about things that increase respect for things like property rights, which we think is fundamental to development of democracy. Also things like the flow of capital and trade. We think that these things are really important for the development of democracy because they make people wealthier. We think that we need to note that the policies of austerity as opening opposition successfully characterized are no longer advocated or as extremely by the IMF. So what we think is what they're advocating for is flow of capital, right? So what they're talking about is they want an injection of capital. We think that having investors from foreign countries being able to invest from literally any country that's in one of these trade alliances, which are larger in our side of the house, that means that governments, we get the type of injection that open governments say they want, right? Because governments can't make that type of injection when their economy has been ruined. When there's more money from the international markets, that happens. Trade brings new goods into a country, which they don't get in their side of the house because they only be from one of two blocks, because the word alternative means that it's substitutive, not additive. Closing government should note that. Moreover, secondly, lowers prices of those things and generally improves standards of living, right? So what that means, no thank you, is that, and also in terms of property rights, respect for investors' property rights, not arbitrarily seizing their assets and creating a culture of property rights, is one of the fundamental things democracy depends upon, because that's really important. Okay, so why does democracy depend on these things? Because as that happens, and it has happened over the past several years, and people get access to more of these things, become generally wealthier, maybe the distribution isn't exactly what we would like to see, but as people get wealthier, citizens end up living longer because they have access to better medicines. They end up living, spending less time working as there's more automation and they're higher paid. So access to things like electronics makes access to news engagement more able to hold your government accountable because you have an iPhone and can read the news in South Africa. So we think that all those things are why that type of economic development has led in the long term to a general increase in standards of living and democratization and more accountability in these countries. We think specifically you can't get that on their side of the house. Why? Because the incentives of the West are the ones to produce those, and they do say in open government they want to have a policy that is specifically an alternative to that with different conditions. The West wants to promote democracy. China, which will dominate, does not have an interest in promoting democracy. But moreover, it also weakens the incentives of the West to promote democracy because of the type of competition that they incentivize, right? They incentivize a race to the bottom where the point about democracy becomes less and less important, and you don't want to incentivize institutions to democratize, and the IMF doesn't feel like it can attach that condition because if it does, the ruling elites in a country might opt out and go into a BRICS institution. So the IMF and the West is less able to advocate for those things. Because in the long term, this policy weakens democracy and development in the developing world, which we believe is a fundamental good, we are incredibly happy to oppose closing opposition.
Alright, let's thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. Government to close the case for side government.
The reasons that London and New York stand today as the world's largest financial centres are largely a fluke. In Britain's case, it was the fact that it happened to be a particularly large sector of Victorian capital export to the rest of the world in the 1880s. In the case of the United States, it was the fact that it was able to step in as the world's largest economy at the point of the suspension of the gold standard in 1914. We believe that these arbitrary factors shouldn't continue to dominate the world global financial scene, and instead what we ought to be seeking is deep financial markets that exist within Delhi and exist within Beijing. We believe that when the BRICS countries are able to access finance on similar terms to countries like the United States, these are the countries that need this finance more, given they have more productive investment opportunities and are going to be more likely to produce good results in terms of development more generally. First, I'm going to look at what creates a fairer global economic order. Secondly, I'm going to look at what aids development. We believe there's a huge problem with the US's exorbitant privilege that they currently have. So the US is able to, because of the fact that it experiences hegemony as with its currency, is able to borrow money at far lower rates than it lends at, because it lends it lends its money out for very long-term projects and borrows for short-term projects at high rates and borrows at long rates as a result of deep financial markets within the United States. We believe that it's largely a fluke that this has been clustered within the United States and the US has been able to gain access to this income. They say, well, you haven't shown why fairness ought to be an important criteria here. We think it's important at the point that countries are able to gain access to capital. The fact that Shanghai still isn't a major financial centre and is instead dependent on other financial sectors in order to gain its money, because we think there is an inherent bias that exists in terms of what happens when major financial institutions are based out of New York and are operating there. We believe there are far more likely to be effective loans that have an understanding of the potential opportunities within BRICS countries when major financial institutions operate within those countries. How does this change? At the moment, the IMF and the countries that fund most of it have an incentive to set up restrictions on the types of currencies that take part of the IMF's unit of account, the special drawing right. What that means is that currencies like the renminbi and other BRICS currencies are far less likely to be included. In addition, there's far less flexibility to lend in terms of other countries' currencies, and as a result, loans are far less likely to be denominated in that. They say that there's a problem insofar as the dollar has been traditionally stable, and as a result ought to be what we are lending in. We think that China is far more likely to adopt transparent practices with respect to its monetary policy at the point it has an incentive to get other countries to join its institutions. So note, like China could at the moment give out loans to any African country it wants. We assume there's something different at the point it's establishing an international institution. Because note, even though the US dominates the IMF, it isn't the only country, and countries like China are indeed members of that. Similarly, China, when it founded the AIIB, invited in other countries like the UK, like Singapore, like Australia, who were able to moderate its influence, and as a result are able to have strong structural controls over that. We believe there are going to be differences in terms of voting rights, but we don't believe there's going to be a fundamental difference in terms of accountability. At the point China needs to build up the credibility of this organisation, it's likely to have transparent monetary policy practices, which mean we're not going to see things like the shock trading on the Shanghai Composite Index in 2015, which had a dramatic effect on Chinese economic activity over the last year. As a result, trade becomes far more accountable. What do closing opposition say in response to this? So they say it's really easy to use one currency because it's really difficult converting when you're doing trade. Note that the main cost here isn't the cost of a minor conversion fee that you're paying here when you can look up a rate on xe.com and then put a standing order through a bank very quickly. Instead, what we're talking about more differently is the fact we're lending in US dollar terms. And what that means is that any fluctuations of the local currency with respect to the US dollar are likely to have particularly catastrophic effects on developing nations. That's why, for example, Turkey's economy tanked after Fed tightening meant that that was exported and adopted within the Turkish central bank's policy, because the Turkish central bank has to mirror the policy of the Federal Reserve because it's lending in US dollar terms and will ultimately have to pay that money back in US dollar terms. What we allow is for countries to gain access to loans in currencies that are far more likely to be correlated with their local situation. So, for example, at the point that Namibia's GDP has a high correlation with the GDP of South Africa, we believe these international institutions ought to be more willing to make these loans in rand, such that Namibia is more likely to be able to pay that off, and they're going to be facing symmetrical shocks, which mean they're adequately able to respond in terms of their monetary policy to this, and not face a loan portfolio, which is reflected in a far different way to how their domestic monetary policy ought to be acting. What this gives countries is more flexibility to be able to act how they want, and it creates more transparency. I'll take a PI from opening now.
So you tell us it's fairer if half the world is dependent on US economic policy, now the other half is dependent on China. The difference is, now companies in developing countries can't borrow, because if they don't use the dollar as a reserve currency, they don't have access to to develop global financial markets. So until you get the sort of financial development you're looking for, you kill any chance of economic development in the developing world.
Look, when the loan portfolio is denominated in these currencies, it deepens the capital markets. That's the history that we've seen with respect to how the US has developed by being able to bring in a lot of money because of the fact that people want to trade in that currency. That's when you create the ability to have loan portfolios that are well situated within particular centres and build those up. Let's now look at how this affects development more broadly. So one of the contentions of open government is that this is going to wreak havoc with free trade. We find this unlikely. Note that the BRICS countries aren't catastrophically poor nations who are still trying to build up basic industry and develop. Instead, they're countries which are often the most aggressive in pursuing free trade. So note that within the last few years, China's been particularly aggressive in signing free trade deals with Australia, Switzerland, and New Zealand, and is in fact negotiating the RCEP at the moment, a trade agreement which is going to include the ASEAN 13, India, China, Australia, and New Zealand. We believe that given China's immense interest in being able to sell its industrial products, it's highly likely to pursue policies of free trade that allow it to develop. The next thing they say is that you have a problem, though, where you have two different sets of rules. We believe that this is the status quo with regards to the wide range of multilateral options that exist. What we do is we create competition for the best type of situations. For example, with regards to the loans by the AIIB, we believe that people ought to be able to opt into this at the point they're able to give them better terms. And that's the competition that drives these changes. Opening say, no, but you have a 20-year loan term, hence you're tied in with the long term. Well, what you could do is you could take out a loan to pay back the loan to the IMF using AIIB money, and as a result, you'd no longer be bound by IMF conditions. This gives far more flexibility and it allows countries to develop in a more flexible way. Very proud to propose.
And the speaker very much for that fine speech and call upon opposition for political cases by opposition and the as well.
I know, it's the 10th debate, 4 days straight of debating, we're all tired. And I suppose that might explain why, between their two speeches, Cambridge A seemed to have fallen asleep for 7 minutes, because they didn't respond to our extension in any way whatsoever, nor did they acknowledge its existence. So I'm going to talk about that first of all, and why that's going to win us this debate, at least beat Cambridge anyway. And then I'm going to talk about economics and the impact on developing countries, in terms of being able to borrow and so on, and all the stuff that they talked about. So what did we tell you? We told you that structurally, the priorities that organizations, the Bretton Woods organizations, and the kind of organizations that they're going to be talking about, it's only going to be China, I think it's pretty clear at this stage that it's only going to be China, are quite different. Because one is going to be building things which are in their interest. One is going to be building roads to the resource infrastructure that they can use to power all of their machines and so on, right? And all the other things that they need to power. The other is going to be focused on opening up those countries for the same ideological reasons that opening government gave you. And what that means is that those countries are going to be more open and trading with far more countries in the world. And moreover, because there is just one group of these organizations, because there is just one World Trade Organization, no thank you, because there is just one IMF, they're going to have a much easier, more coherent multilateral trade policy, which means that it's going to be much easier for those countries to be economically open. And when you are economically open and the wealth in your country increases, and when property rights is more valued, for instance, as the IMF and WTO do, you are going to get a much more democratic country, because you're going to get countries where democratic values are far more respected and emphasized, where people have iPhones with which they can go and read the newspapers and so on, but where people also have the will to do so, and where the political figures are going to listen to them. We think that that's more important because that means that those countries are not only economically better off, no thank you, but politically better off as well, because they don't face the kind of brutal oppression that they often do on their side of the house. We think that's the most important thing in this debate. It's a shame that closing government didn't seem to realise that it happened at all. But, no thank you. So what did they tell us though? They told us about US hegemony, and they thought that was an awful thing. At the beginning they told us that it was an awful thing because it's arbitrary and unfair. They seem to just not like the idea that Washington do things, that things happen arbitrarily. Well, we told us that this is a wash, right? Because it's equally arbitrary, surely, that Shanghai will be able to control the economic situation in the world. And the reason that it will be Shanghai, no thank you, is that BRICS is an outdated idea. I mean, no one's been talking about BRICS since 2011. And the reason is that B, or I, and S are completely screwed. You know, I mean, like, you know, the Russian economy, and this is not just kind of short-term stuff, no thank you, that their member tried to tell you in his speech. You know, it's structural economic reasons. It's to do with Russia's over-reliance on oil, and oil prices being dropped so low because of US investment in it. It's to do with the Brazilian economy, well, it's to do with actually corruption with the Brazilian economy, no thank you, and so on. But even if that wasn't true, right, even if those countries somehow managed to turn it around, China have a far larger economy than any of them. China is going to have far more power than any of them because it's going to be a far bigger contributor than any of them. And so they don't just get to weasel out of this idea that of the wash that they've stuck themselves into economically and politically. But even if it's not a wash somehow, by the way, their fairness thing, he was like, here's why fairness is important. And the reason that he said why fairness is important is because it's better economically for people in developing countries. So clearly fairness is not more important than the other things. But no, thank you. But even if we don't get that, and somehow we do get some mad competition between the BRICS and so on, what we think is worse about that is that it means that the developing countries who are paying debts to these organizations and so on have a much less stable time. Why? Because if the currency your debts are in fluctuates, then your debts fluctuate also. That was their problem with the Federal Reserve deciding the dollar and so on. The reason that that becomes a bigger problem on their side of the house is that those currencies, no thank you, are stronger. So the reason that, let's say, a shock in the US economy is less likely to affect the dollar, or will affect the dollar less than a shock in the Brazilian economy will affect the currency of Brazil, is that there is far more demand for the dollar. So if there's a drop in demand in some place, the massive amount of demand means that relatively that is a lower drop in demand than it would otherwise be. So a shock in, for instance, one of those BRICS economies would affect it far more as a result. So the currency is going to fluctuate more when the economy experiences a shock, which means that those debts are going to fluctuate more and those countries are going to have a much worse time. No, thank you. So their prop point is not point. But moreover, then they told us, oh, it's awful easy because contributions to the WTO are in dollars and that means that the US can pay it all. I don't understand this. Maybe I'm stupid and this is the debate winning point, right? But I don't understand why China can't just pay more dollars to the WTO. You turn their wands into dollars, turn more wands into dollars, and then pay more dollars. That didn't make any sense to me. No, thank you. But the point is, all financial centres are relatively weaker on that side of the house, on their side of the house. And that means that their main point about this, their entire crux of their extension, which is economic stability, no longer applies. And as a result, their extension doesn't make too much sense. I will very close.
China can currently give any development loan it wants and have full control over
Sorry,
that.
can you speak up, sorry?
China can currently give any development loan it wants and have full control over that. Do you think the involvement of other countries who might then hold it accountable might be a reason it's instead founding an international development institution?
Well, I think that we've proven that involvement isn't going to happen anyway, and that even if there is some kind of involvement in institutions, China are going to be able to do that. What we think is far more important is that the institution that those countries are able to turn to instead of China, which will give those which will give those loans at the most competitive rate and in the best way, are the Bretton Woods institutions, which are going to give them the kind of political development that we talk about, which is the most important thing in this debate. Quickly to do with OG stuff and how that fit into things, because they had a couple of other things as well. First of all, they said that neoliberal policies are bad and British people are going to be Keynesians and so on. So we got good reasons from OO about why we don't think that necessarily China and the BRICS countries are going to be massively better. But regardless, they told us that, for instance, free trade is bad. We said maybe you'll get trade wars in your side of the house. Bring it on, they say. I mean, good luck to you. But look. The reason that free trade is such a good thing is that it makes goods and services cheaper for the people who buy them, because there is competition from businesses all over the world within that country, and businesses which are massive and can benefit from economies of scale and make their goods and services cheaper. What we're able to do on our side of the house is make the goods and services the people in the poorest countries buy cheap enough that they can get an awful lot of them. We make it so that they can improve their wealth and that they can use that and use the help from those institutions to democratize their countries and improve their political structures. Because it benefits them, and because it was nonsense to say that Brits are going to do anything in this debate, we beg to oppose.
I'd like to then ask you for another speech. For another round of applause, all speakers, what was the next thing now?